I inherited a vacant lot, but underground I found a buried safe. James Miller was holding a hoe when the blade hit something metallic in the middle of that abandoned lot. His mother, Susan, had insisted he sell that piece of land his grandfather George left as an inheritance, but the 28-year-old decided to first see what was there. When he finally managed to dig around the object, his eyes widened. It was a golden safe, heavy, with a lock that looked like it came from an old movie. Strange symbols were engraved on the lid, and the metal, despite being buried, shone as if it were new. "Mom!" James shouted, running to Susan's house 2 blocks away in the Hope Heights neighborhood on the outskirts of New York City. "You won't believe what I found." Susan was preparing lunch when her son burst through the kitchen door, covered in dirt and his eyes shining with excitement. "James, how many times have I told you to leave that lot alone?" Susan sighed, stirring the beans in the pot. "Just sell it and be done with it." "But Mom, there's a safe buried there, a real safe like in the movies." The spoon slipped from Susan's hand and hit the floor with a sharp clatter. Her face instantly paled. A safe?" she stammered. "Yeah, big, golden, with weird designs on it. There must be a fortune inside." Susan leaned against the sink, her legs shaking. For a moment, James thought she might faint. "Son, for heaven's sake, leave that thing alone. Go back, bury it again, and let's sell that lot today." "What do you mean, bury it again? Mom, are you crazy? There could be enough money for us to move out of this rented house." "James Robert Miller," Susan shouted, using his full name as she did when she was truly angry. "I'm serious, don't touch it again." The young man had never seen his mother so upset. Susan had always been a calm woman, working as a seamstress for over 30 years to support the family after his father left. Seeing her eyes filled with a fear he couldn't understand unsettled James. "All right, Mom, but at least tell me why you're so scared." Susan turned her back and went back to stirring the beans, but James could see her hands trembling. "Your grandfather? He wasn't an easy man, son. Some things are better left buried." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. That afternoon, James couldn't get the safe out of his head. While working at Frank's auto repair shop, he kept imagining what could be inside. Money, jewelry, important documents. When he got home, he found Susan sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee in her hands. "Mum, did you really know Grandpa George well?" Susan sighed heavily. "Not well, and not kindly, son. My father was a complicated man. After your grandmother Margaret passed, he became even stranger. Stopped talking to the family, isolated himself on that lot. But why? There were some troubles in the family, things that happened before you were born. It's better not to dig up the past." "What kind of troubles?" Susan stood up abruptly. "Enough, James. I've told you I don't want to talk about it." She left the kitchen, leaving her son alone with his questions. James knew there was something his mother wasn't telling him, and it only deepened his curiosity about the safe. The next day, James returned to the lot. It was a piece of land about 500 square meters, overgrown with tall weeds and debris. For years, no one in the family had set foot there. Grandpa George had lived in a small house on the other side of town, and only visited that lot occasionally, always alone. The safe was still there, partially exposed where James had dug. It was smaller than a refrigerator but looked heavy. The lock was truly elaborate, with 3 cylinders that needed to be turned in a specific sequence. "Wow, this is crazy stuff," murmured James, trying to move the cylinders. They wouldn't budge. "You're George's grandson, right?" James turned and saw an elderly man about 70 standing at the fence dividing the neighbor's property. He wore a straw hat and had very light blue eyes. "Yes, sir. Did you know my grandfather?" "Sure did, son. I'm Harold. I've lived next door for 40 years. Your grandfather was a strange man, but not a bad one." "Strange how?" Harold stepped closer to the fence, eyeing the safe with curiosity. He'd come here every dawn, especially toward the end of his life. Spent hours digging around, but no one ever knew what he was doing. "Every dawn?" "Every single one. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom and see his flashlight out here. Went on for about 2 years till he got sick." James was intrigued. His grandfather had buried the safe recently then. Do you know what kind of man he was? Harold scratched his grey beard. Well, son, when I moved here there were already rumors about your family, but I always figured folks just like to make up stories, you know how it is. What kind of rumors? Oh, nonsense from idle people. They said your grandfather had done some ugly things in the past, that's why the family didn't speak to him. But I always saw him as a hard-working, quiet man. He was a watchmaker, fixed clocks for everyone in the neighborhood. A watchmaker? James didn't know that. Susan had never mentioned her grandfather's profession. Do you know where the house he lived in is? Sure do. It's over in Westview near the church. A little blue house with a white gate. After he passed, it was left abandoned. I think some of his things are still there. James thanked him for the information and decided he'd visit his grandfather's old house the next day. Maybe he'd find a clue about how to open that safe. When he got home, he found Susan talking to a woman he didn't recognize. She was in her mid-60s, well-dressed, with grey hair tied in a bun. James, this is your Aunt Barbara, your grandfather's sister. James's eyes widened. He'd never met this aunt. Good afternoon, Aunt Barbara. She looked him up and down with an expression that wasn't exactly friendly. So, you're the grandson who inherited the land? Yes, Mum. Well, I came here to talk to your mother about that. I think we need to discuss this inheritance. Susan seemed uncomfortable. Barbara, we've already talked about this. The will was very clear. The will may be clear, but justice is another matter, Susan. George was my older brother. I have rights too. James felt the tension in the air. Excuse me, but what rights, Aunt Barbara? Half of whatever's found on that land belongs to me by right, boy. Especially if it's something George hid from the family. James's heart raced. How did she know something was hidden? Do you know something specific? Barbara exchanged a glance with Susan. I know my brother kept secrets, and I know some of those secrets could be worth a lot of money. Susan stood up nervously. Barbara, please, let's leave the past alone. No, Susan. The past has caused enough suffering in this family. It's time to settle things. James was lost, but sensed there was much more to this conversation than he realized. Mum, what are you talking about? Nothing important, son. Aunt Barbara was just visiting. Barbara grabbed her purse and stood. James, if you find anything on that land, come to me. I have information that might be useful to you. She left, leaving James full of questions and Susan even more nervous. Mum, what's this all about? What secrets was Aunt Barbara talking about? Forget it, James. Barbara has always been too dramatic. Let's have dinner. But James couldn't forget. That night he lay awake thinking about everything that had happened. The safe, the rumors the neighbor mentioned, his mother's strange reaction, his aunt showing up out of nowhere, talking about secrets and rights. The next day after work, James went to Westview to look for his grandfather's old house. It wasn't hard to find. It was exactly as Harold had described, a simple blue house with a small front garden now overgrown with weeds. The gate was unlocked. James looked around to make sure no one was watching and stepped onto the property. The house had clearly been abandoned for months. The windows were shut, but he managed to get in through the back, where he found a door with a broken lock. The inside of the house was simple, a small living room, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen and a bathroom. But what caught James's attention was one of the bedrooms, which had been turned into a workshop. There was a workbench covered in small tools, magnifying glasses and scattered clock parts. The walls were covered in technical drawings, diagrams and blueprints James couldn't make sense of. He searched through drawers and cabinets. Most were empty, but in one of the workbench drawers he found a notebook with his grandfather's notes. The handwriting was shaky, as if written by someone in poor health, but still legible. The safe will remain secure until the right time comes. The 3 keys are in the places she knew. When they find them, they'll know I always knew the truth. 3 keys? James reread the note several times. His grandfather had designed a safe that required 3 different keys to open. He kept searching and found more papers. Technical blueprints, lock schematics, and a handwritten sheet with 3 addresses. St. Joseph's Church, right side altar, behind the clock. Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, Margaret Miller's tomb, Rosebush. Hope Heights, house number 247 under the stairs. James copied the addresses into his phone. The third address was the house where he lived with his mother. There was something hidden under the stairs. When he got home, Susan was watching TV in the living room. "Mom, I need to look for something under the stairs." "Under the stairs? Why?" "I found some of Grandpa's notes at his house. It seems he hid some things here." Susan stood up quickly. "James, I don't want you messing with your grandfather's things. I've told you 1,000 times. Mom, please, you're hiding something from me. I just want to understand." "There's nothing to understand. Your grandfather was a man who liked to complicate things. That's all." But James had already made up his mind. He waited for Susan to go to bed and went downstairs to examine the area under the stairs. It was a dark corner where his mother kept brooms and cleaning supplies. He felt along the walls until he found a spot where the plaster seemed different. He poked at it with a screwdriver and managed to remove a small piece of filler. Behind it was a hole in the brick, and inside the hole, wrapped in plastic, was a small golden key. James held the key up to the light. It was intricate, with the same kind of engraving he'd seen on the safe. It was definitely one of the 3 keys his grandfather had mentioned. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now, continuing. On Saturday morning, James decided to go after the second key. Evergreen Memorial Cemetery was on the other side of town, but he took 2 buses and arrived around 10 o'clock. Finding Margaret Miller's tomb was easier than he'd expected. It was a simple grave, with a white marble headstone and a small iron fence around it. In the corner stood a rose bush with vibrant red flowers still in bloom. James looked around to make sure he was alone and began digging gently beside the rose bush. He didn't have to dig very deep. About 8 inches below the soil, his fingers touched something metallic. It was a small metal box, and inside it, another golden key identical to the first. But there was also a folded piece of paper. James carefully opened it. It was a letter, written in a woman's delicate handwriting. "George, my love, if you're reading this, it means you managed to prove your innocence. Forgive a wife who didn't have the courage to believe your words when everyone was against you. I always knew in my heart that you were incapable of doing what they said. Keep this evidence until the right moment. Our family deserves to know the truth. With all my love and regret, Margaret." James read the letter 3 times, trying to understand. Evidence? Innocence? What had his grandfather been accused of? He tucked the letter and the key away and returned home with his mind buzzing with questions. Susan was in the kitchen when he arrived. "Mom, did you know Grandma Margaret left a letter for Grandpa?" Susan dropped the cup she was washing. The shards scattered across the floor. Where did you find that?" "At the cemetery, along with one of the safe keys." "Mom, what was Grandpa accused of?" Susan bent down to pick up the pieces, but James could see she was crying. "Mom, your grandfather," Susan began, her voice trembling. "Your grandfather was accused of stealing very valuable jewelry from a wealthy family where he worked as a clockmaker. It was over 40 years ago." "And did he really steal it?" Back then everyone believed he did. Even your grandmother had doubts. The family was so ashamed they stopped speaking to him. I was young, just 17, and I ended up believing what everyone was saying. But what if he was innocent?" Susan stood up, wiping her tears. "If he was..." She paused. "Oh my God, James. What if he really was innocent, and we spent all these years..." For the first time, James saw his mother struck by the possibility that her father might have been wronged. "Mom, there's still 1 key left. It's at St. Joseph's Church behind the side altar clock." "How do you know that?" "I found his notes at the house. He planned everything carefully. He wanted someone in the family to discover the truth." Susan sank heavily into a chair. 40 years, James. 40 years thinking my father was a thief. "Should we get the 3rd key tomorrow?" Susan hesitated, but then nodded. "Yes. If your grandfather left something that could clear his name, I think he deserves for us to find it." On Sunday morning, James and Susan went to St. Joseph's Church. It was an old church, built in the 1950s with side altars dedicated to various saints. The right side altar was dedicated to St. George. Behind it was an old wall clock frozen in time for many years. Susan spoke to the priest, explaining they needed to check something her late father had left behind. The priest, a kind man in his 60s, allowed them to examine the clock. James climbed onto a chair and managed to move the clock away from the wall. Behind it was a small hole in the plaster, and there lay the third key along with a note. If you've made it this far, you're ready to know the truth. Use all 3 keys at once, turning them to the right. What you find will show that a man may be judged unfairly, but the truth always outlasts time. For my grandson, whom I hope will be better than we were, George Miller. Susan wept as she read the note. He knew you'd find all this. Seems like it, Mom. Should we open the safe? They returned to the property that same afternoon. James had brought a flashlight and some tools to clean the safe more thoroughly. With the 3 keys in hand, Susan and James knelt beside the safe. Each key fit perfectly into one of the 3 locks. Shall we turn them together? James asked. Susan nodded, still nervous. They turned all 3 keys to the right simultaneously. There was a click, and the safe's lid opened with a soft creak. Inside, there was no money or jewelry. Instead, they found documents carefully protected in plastic bags, old photographs, and a letter addressed to my family. James opened the letter and began reading aloud. If you're reading this, the time has finally come for the truth to come out. I was accused of stealing the Almeida family's jewelry set in 1983. At the time, I worked repairing the antique clocks in their mansion. The jewels disappeared the same week I was there, and I was the only suspect. What no one knew was that I had discovered the real thief was the family's own son, Richard Thompson. He had gambling debts and stole his mother's jewelry to pay them off. When he realized suspicion would fall on him, he framed me. I had proof, but Richard threatened me. He said if I told the truth, he would fabricate other accusations against me and destroy my family. I was a simple man, with no means to defend myself against a powerful family, so I decided to keep the evidence until the right moment. In the boxes are the photos I secretly took of Richard selling the jewels, documents proving his debts, and a recording I managed to make of him confessing everything. Forgive me for carrying this secret for so long. Forgive me for not having the courage to fight the injustice at the time. I hope one day you can use this evidence to clear my name and our family's name. Susan was sobbing by the time James finished reading. 40 years, James. 40 years thinking my father was guilty, and my mother, poor thing, she died believing she had married a thief. James opened one of the smaller boxes inside the safe. Inside were black and white photographs, clearly showing a young man selling jewelry to a fence. On the back of one photo was written, Richard Thompson, March 15, 1983. Another box contained bank documents showing Richard's gambling debts and letters from collectors threatening his family. But the most crucial piece was in a small wooden box, an old tape recorder with a cassette. Shall we listen? James asked. Susan nodded. James had brought an old radio that still had a cassette player. He inserted the tape and pressed play. The voice that came from the device was that of a young man, clearly nervous. Listen, George, I know you found out I was the one who took my mother's jewels. But look, you're going to keep quiet about this, understand? I have important friends. I can make up any story about you. Who do you think they'll believe? The son of a respected family or some poor watchmaker? If you stay silent, I'll make sure the charges aren't too harsh. But if you decide to say anything... The recording continued, with Richard confessing details of the theft and his threats. Susan and James exchanged glances, both in shock. Mom, Grandpa really was innocent. He was, and I spent my whole life not speaking to him because of a lie. Suddenly, they heard voices approaching. It was Barbara, accompanied by a middle-aged man James didn't recognize. Susan, James! Barbara shouted. What are you doing there? The man with her stepped forward. He was well-dressed, with an unfriendly expression. I'm Richard Thompson, Jr., an attorney. My family has an interest in this property and anything that might be buried here. James felt his stomach turn. Thompson. The same last name as the man who had framed his grandfather. And what would that interest be? asked James, instinctively shielding the safe. My grandfather, Richard Thompson, was the victim of a robbery many years ago. We have reason to believe evidence of that crime might be hidden here. Barbara stepped closer to the safe. So you really found it? I knew George had kept something important. Aunt, how did you know about the safe? Because your grandfather told me everything before he passed, James. He gave me an address and said if the family ever wanted to know the truth, they should look here. Richard Jr. tried to peer inside the safe. What's in there? James quickly shut the lid. Family personal documents. I'll need to examine those documents. If they contain evidence of a crime. Hold on. Susan stood up, furious. What crime? The only crime here was your grandfather framing an innocent man. Richard Jr. looked stunned. Excuse me. James glanced at his mother and then at the lawyer. It's true. Your grandfather stole the family jewels and framed mine, and we have the proof. That's absurd. My grandfather was a respected man. He was a thief and a liar, Susan shot back, and now we can prove it. Barbara looked confused. What is this all about? Susan, you never told me any of this. Because I just found out, Barbara. We just heard your brother's recording. He had taped Richard confessing everything. Richard Jr. paled. What recording? James opened the safe again and showed the cassette tape. A recording of your grandfather, admitting he stole the jewels and threatening mine to keep quiet. This can't be true. Want to hear it? James played the tape again. As the voice of Richard Sr. confessed to the crime and made the threats, the lawyer's face grew paler. When the recording ended, there was a heavy silence. My God, Richard Jr. murmured. 40 years. 40 years thinking my grandfather was a victim. Barbara sat on a rock, still processing everything. George, poor George, he endured this injustice alone. And do you know why? Susan had tears in her eyes. Because he wanted to protect the family. He'd rather be seen as guilty than risk something happening to us. Richard Jr. stepped forward, visibly shaken. I need to apologize. On behalf of my family, I'm sorry for what my grandfather did. Apologies aren't all that matter now, said James. My grandfather deserves to have his name cleared publicly. You're right. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I'll contact all the newspapers that covered the case back then. I'll speak to the whole family. Your grandfather's name will be cleared. Barbara stood and hugged Susan. Sister, forgive me. All these years I also believed George was guilty. We were unfair to him. It wasn't just us, Barbara. Everyone was. Even Mom had doubts. James looked at everyone there and felt a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because his grandfather had carried that burden alone for so long, and relief because the truth had finally come out. There's one more thing, said James, pulling another folder from the safe. Inside was a document that left everyone speechless. It was a deed of donation. Grandfather George had left the land not just to James, but also to a woman named Dorothy Wilson, with a note. Half of this land rightfully belongs to the Wilson family. May it be returned with apologies for the years of silence. Who is Dorothy Wilson? Asked Susan. I have no idea, James replied. Richard Jr. offered to help them find Dorothy Wilson through his lawyer connections. 2 days later, he called with the information. I found her. Dorothy Wilson, 78, lives in Liberty Heights. I can give you the address. James and Susan went to Mrs. Dorothy's house on a Thursday afternoon. It was a simple, well-kept little house with a garden full of flowers in front. Mrs. Dorothy welcomed them into the living room. She was an elegant lady with completely white hair and still very lively eyes. So you're from George's family, she said, serving coffee. I've been expecting you for a long time. Did you know my grandfather? Asked James. Yes, my dear. I knew him since we were children. We were neighbors when we were young, right here in this neighborhood. Susan leaned forward. Mrs. Dorothy, we found a document saying that half of my father's land belongs to your family. Do you know why? Mrs. Dorothy took a deep breath as if about to tell a very old story. Sit comfortably because this story is long. She settled into her armchair and began. My father, William Wilson, was your great-grandfather's business partner, George's father. They had a small jewelry store here in the neighborhood in the 1940s. When my father was called to war, he left half of the business secured in a piece of land they bought together. The land where we found the safe? Asked James. Exactly, but my father didn't return from the war. And George's father, with no way to prove the partnership because the documents were lost in a fire, kept everything. Susan's eyes widened. So your father was wronged by our family? He was, but not out of malice, understand. It was wartime, many things were lost, many documents disappeared. George's father even tried to find my family to divide it, but we had moved to another neighborhood. And how did my grandfather find out? Because I looked for him about 15 years ago. I had found some of my father's letters among my mother's things, which proved the partnership. I went to talk to George. Mrs. Dorothy stood up and fetched a shoebox. Look what he told me that day. She showed a letter written in Grandfather George's handwriting. Mrs. Dorothy, after hearing your story, I'm certain you're telling the truth. My father always said he had a partner who went to war and never returned, but we never knew what happened to his family. This land rightfully belongs to you as well. Unfortunately, I can't resolve this now because I'm caught up in a complicated situation with my own family. But I promise I'll leave everything documented so my descendants can correct this injustice. James and Susan exchanged glances, moved. Mrs. Dorothy, said Susan, do you want half of the land? No, my dear. I'm an old woman now. I don't need land anymore. But I'd like to suggest something. What, Mrs. Dorothy? How about we turn that land into something beautiful for the community? A park, a square, something to honor the memory of our fathers and your grandfather. James felt his heart warm at the idea. That would be perfect, Mrs. Dorothy. My grandfather would be so happy. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing, in the following weeks, the story took on a scale none of them expected. Richard Jr. kept his promise and reached out to all the media outlets that had covered the original case. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. After 40 years, watchmaker cleared of robbery, he didn't commit. The article told the whole story, from the discovery of the safe to the evidence confirming George Miller's innocence. The impact was greater than they anticipated. People in the neighborhood who knew the family began reaching out to Susan to apologize. Neighbors who had avoided greeting her for years started speaking to her normally again, but the most emotional reaction came from an unexpected person. James was at home on a Saturday morning when the doorbell rang. Outside stood a well-dressed man in his 50s, accompanied by a woman of the same age and 2 teenagers. Are you James, grandson of Mr. George? The man asked. Yes, sir, I am. I'm Charles Thompson, grandson of Richard Thompson. This is my wife Sharon and our children Peter and Amy. James tensed up. Another member of the family that had framed his grandfather. Can I help you with something? Actually, we came here to help you. After the story came out in the newspaper, our whole family was deeply shaken. We discovered our great-grandfather wasn't the man we thought he was. Sharon stepped forward. James, we brought something that might interest you. She showed an old wooden box. These are the original jewels that were stolen. They've been kept at my mother-in-law's house for decades. No one knew the true story behind them. James called Susan, who came to the door still wary. Mum, this is the family of the man who framed Grandpa. Susan stiffened, but Charles approached respectfully. Mrs. Susan, I know our family caused you a lot of pain. We can't undo the harm that was done, but we want to try to make things right however we can. How so? Susan asked. Sharon opened the box, revealing a stunning set of antique jewelry, a pearl necklace, diamond earrings, a gold bracelet with precious stones. These jewels rightfully belong to your family now. They were bought with your father's unjust suffering. We want to return them. Susan began to cry. I can't accept this. Please take them, Charles insisted. It's the only way we can show we recognize our family's mistake. James looked at his mother and then at the Thompson family. We'll accept, but on one condition. What is it? Charles asked. That these jewels be sold and the money used to create the community park we want to build on the land. That way, they'll bring joy to the community instead of sorrow. Peter, Charles's teenage son, stepped forward. Can I say something? Of course, said James. When my dad told me the whole story, I kept thinking, you had every right to be angry with us, but instead, you're thinking of doing something good for everyone. That's really cool. Amy, his daughter, added, my history teacher always says the injustices of the past are only corrected when we choose to do good instead of seeking revenge. Susan smiled through her tears. You're very wise children. Charles grew emotional. Mrs. Susan, James, if you'll allow us, our family would like to help with the park, whether it's money, labor, or whatever you need. It would be an honor, James replied. That afternoon, the two families sat in Susan's kitchen to plan the future of the land. The park idea grew and took shape. Mrs. Dorothy suggested it include a play area for children and a space for seniors to gather. Barbara, who now visited Susan regularly, proposed adding a community garden where neighbors could plant together. Richard Jr. offered to handle all the legal and bureaucratic work free of charge. Charles said his construction company would donate the necessary materials. Within 2 months, the project was ready. The park would be called George Miller Truth Square and have 3 main areas: a playground for children, a space with benches and tables for seniors, and a community garden. At the center of the square would be a small memorial, the original safe from Grandpa George, now opened and turned into a planter with a plaque telling his story. The opening day was set for a Saturday morning. James woke up early, nervous and excited. That was the day her grandfather would finally be honored publicly. When she arrived at the lot, dozens of people were already waiting. Neighbors of all ages, members of the Miller, Thompson, and Wilson families, local officials, and even journalists who wanted to witness the end of the story. Susan looked beautiful, wearing the pearl necklace that had belonged to the Thompson family, but now symbolized the reconciliation between the families. Mrs. Dorothy, at 78, insisted on being there and was the first to speak. My dears, today we're not just opening a park. We're planting seeds of forgiveness, justice, and hope for future generations. Charles Thompson stepped onto the small makeshift stage. On behalf of my family, I publicly apologize for the injustice committed against George Miller. May this square serve as a reminder that the truth always prevails, even if it takes 40 years to come to light. Susan was next to speak, and her voice trembled with emotion. My father, George Miller, was a simple man who chose to bear an injustice alone to protect his family. Today, at last, he can rest in peace, knowing his name has been cleared and that his story has brought people together instead of tearing them apart. Finally, James stepped onto the stage. He looked at the crowd gathered before him and felt his chest tighten with emotion. When I found the safe buried on this lot, I thought I'd found a treasure, and I had. But the treasure wasn't money or jewels. It was the chance to truly know my grandfather, to understand the kind of man he was, and to learn that sometimes the greatest wealth we can leave our children is an example of honesty and dignity. The crowd applauded, and James felt tears streaming down his face. My grandfather planted 3 keys in 3 different places, hoping that one day someone in the family would be curious enough to seek the truth. Today we plant a square, hoping future generations will have the wisdom to cultivate justice and forgiveness. The priest from St. Joseph's Church gave a blessing, and afterward, everyone gathered for a community lunch organized by the neighbors. During the celebration, James stepped away from the crowd and walked to the memorial at the center of the square. The golden safe was now filled with colorful flowers, and the plaque beside it told the full story of George Miller. Mrs. Dorothy approached and stood beside him. Your grandfather would be proud, James. You think so? I'm sure of it. He always said the best revenge against injustice is to do good. Susan joined them with Barbara, both still teary-eyed from crying. Son, Susan said, I want to ask for your forgiveness. Forgiveness for what, Mum? For doubting my father all these years, for not having faith in him when it mattered most. Mum, you were so young when it all happened. You did what you could with the information you had. Barbara hugged her nephew. James, you're wiser than all of us put together. At your age, I would have used that evidence to destroy the Thompson family. You chose to use it to build something beautiful. It wasn't just me, Aunt. It was everyone together. Forgiveness only works when everyone takes part. Peter and Amy Thompson walked over. James, Peter said, my dad mentioned you're about our age. Do you want to be our friend? Of course. It'd be nice to have friends who understand how complicated family secrets can be. Amy laughed. At least now our family secrets are public. Makes it easier. They laughed together, and James realized a new generation was beginning without the weight of past injustices. Late in the afternoon, when everyone had left, James returned once more to the memorial. He touched the plaque bearing his grandfather's name and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. Thank you for keeping the truth for us. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes justice takes a long time to appear, but it's always worth the wait." A gentle breeze swayed the flowers in the safe, and James had the strange feeling that his grandfather was there, finally at peace. 3 months later, George Miller Truth Square had become the neighborhood's favorite gathering spot. Children played on the playground, elders played dominoes at the tables, and the community garden flourished with everyone's care. James had become something of the square's unofficial guardian. Every Saturday morning, he went there to water the memorial flowers and chat with the neighbors. One such morning, he found a surprise. Someone had left a folded note among the flowers in the safe. He opened the paper and read, "To your grandfather George's grandson. My name is Mary, I'm 85, and I was a friend of your grandmother Margaret. I wanted you to know that she told me, just before passing, that she always believed in your grandfather's innocence. She only pretended to have doubts because she feared the threats his family was receiving. Your grandfather never knew this, and carried the pain of thinking even his own wife had doubted him. Now that the truth has come out, I thought you should know the love between them was never truly shaken. With affection, Mary." James carefully tucked the note away. It was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. His grandfather hadn't been abandoned by his wife. She had always believed in him but had to pretend otherwise to protect the family. When he got home, he showed the note to Susan. "Just imagine, Mom. Grandpa died, thinking even Grandma had doubted him, and she died without being able to say she always believed. At least now we know the truth, son, and we know they truly loved each other till the end." "Yeah, and that makes all the difference." Susan smiled. "You know something? Ever since we found all this out, I've been sleeping better. It's like a weight I didn't even know I was carrying has been lifted off my shoulders." "Me too, Mom. Before I thought I came from a family of ordinary people. Now I know I come from a family of dignity. And you, James, are honoring that dignity. Your grandfather would be so proud of the man you've become." That night, James had a dream. He dreamed he was in the square, but it was empty. Suddenly, an elderly man with white hair and work-worn hands appeared. "Are you my grandfather?" James asked in the dream. "Yes, my grandson, I came to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For finding the keys, for having the courage to open the safe, for choosing forgiveness over revenge." "I just did what I thought was right, Grandpa. And that's exactly what I hoped you'd do. You understood that the real legacy I left wasn't the land, but the chance to choose to be better than those who hurt us. You're not sad anymore?" "No, my son. Now I'm at peace. My name has been cleared. My family is united. And you've turned a place of sadness into one of joy. I'm so sorry you suffered alone for so long." "I wasn't alone, James. I always knew the truth would come out one day, and I always knew that when it did, you'd do the right thing." James woke up with tears in his eyes, but they were tears of peace. End of story. Now we'd like to know, what did you think of this story of overcoming and forgiveness? Do you believe James made the right decision by turning the land into a community square? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. If you have a family story to share, we'd love to hear it. Don't forget to like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one. Thank you so much for joining us.